The Stanford Research Institute lab had changed by January 1974. More machines, more guards, more shadows under everyone's eyes. Ingo Swann slouched in a corner, sketching aimlessly on a notepad, his pencil tracing the same faceless figure he'd seen too many times now. 2 years of CIA sessions had honed his visions: bases, bunkers, missile silos. But that shadow kept creeping in, sharper with every dive. He hadn't told Russell Targ or Harold Puthoff, hadn't told Richard Hensley. It was his burden, and it was getting heavier. The door swung open, and a new face stepped in, Pat Price, a burly ex-cop from California with a gravelly voice and a handshake like a vice. Targ had recruited him after Swann started buckling under the pace. 20 targets in 6 months, each one a marathon. Price carried a quiet confidence, no smirk like Swann's, just a nod as he dropped into a chair. "Pat's here to lighten the load," Targ said, adjusting his glasses. "He's done some freelance work, impressed a few folks in LA, says he can see like you, Ingo." Swann glanced up, sizing him up. "Good luck with that." Price chuckled, unfazed. "Heard you're the star. I'm just backup." Hensley strode in behind him, a thick file under his arm, Ty Askew from a red-eye flight out of D.C. The CIA had poured cash into the program since Swann's early hits, Kazakhstan, the Enterprise, and Hensley was riding the wave, a pit bull with a bone. He dropped the file on the table, pages spilling, maps, recon shots, a blurry photo of a concrete dome. "New target," Hensley said, voice clipped. "Soviet lab, Semipalatinsk region. Intel says they're cooking something weird, tech we don't have. Swann's off today, Price, you're up." Swann's pencil stilled. "Off? Since when?" "Since you look like hell," Hensley shot back. "You're shaking half the time now. Rest or you're no use." Swann bristled but didn't argue. Truth was, he felt it, bones aching, head buzzing like a busted radio. The shadow wasn't just in the visions anymore. It lingered when he closed his eyes. A silhouette burned into his skull. He nodded, leaning back. "Fine. Let the rookie play." Price took the coordinates from Puthoff. 50 degrees, 10 minutes north, 78 degrees, 40 minutes east, written on a slip with no context. He settled into the chair, closing his eyes as Puthoff hooked up the EEG, its needles twitching. Hensley watched, arms crossed, while Targ hovered with a tape recorder, clicking it on. "Whenever you're ready," Puthoff said. Price breathed deep, slow, like a man sinking into a pool. His voice came low, steady. "Cold. Dust everywhere, dry like a desert. Buildings low and square. Concrete stained. There's a dome big, cracked at the edges. Inside machines. Big ones, humming. Metal tubes, wires, looks like a generator, but off. Something's glowing, faint yellow." His hand moved, sketching blind. A dome, jagged lines for cracks, a tangle of pipes. Hensley leaned closer, eyes on the pad. Price kept going. "Men in coats, lab coats, not military. One's got goggles, holding a rod. Smells sharp, chemical like bleach. There's a hum deep, vibrating the floor. It's amplifying something. Energy, maybe." Swann's head snapped up, a chill running through him. Amplifying. He'd felt vibrations before, Kazakhstan, the carrier, but nothing like this. Price's sketch grew, a device bulky, with coils and a faint outline of a glowing core. Uranium, Swann thought, unbidden. He didn't know how he knew. Price opened his eyes, blinking slow. "That's it. Faded out." Hensley snatched the sketch, holding it to the light. "Amplifier," he muttered. "Son of a bitch." He'd seen a report last month, KGB chatter about psychic enhancement near Semipalatinsk, dismissed as noise. Now here it was, drawn by a guy who'd never left California. Targ stopped the recorder. "Pat, you sure about the glow?" "The hum." "Sure as I can be," Price said, rubbing his neck. Felt like it was pushing something out, waves, maybe. Hard to pin down. Puthoff scribbled notes, equations spilling across his pad. If it's uranium-based, could be radiation boosting a signal. Psychic signal, I mean. Hensley's jaw tightened. "Boosting how? Range? Strength?" "Both," Puthoff said. "Theoretically. We'd need more data." "Then get it," Hensley snapped. "Swann, you're back tomorrow, same target. I want overlap, confirmation." Swann's stomach sank. "Thought I was off." "You were," Hensley said. "Now you're not. They've got something cooking, and we're behind." Swann didn't argue, but his hand clenched the pencil. Another dive meant facing that shadow again. And now this amplifier. What if it wasn't just the Soviets? What if that thing was tied to it, feeding off it? He watched Price stretch, calm as ever, and envied him. Price didn't see the shadow, yet. Hensley gathered the file, barking at Targ. Send this to Langley, priority. We need recon satellites, anything. If they're amplifying psychics, we're in a race. He stormed out, leaving the room buzzing. Price stood, nodding to Swan. Guess we're a team now. Guess so, Swan said, voice flat. He flipped his notepad shut, the shadow's outline hidden inside. Price's vision gnawed at him, glowing cores, humming machines. It felt familiar, like a thread he couldn't pull. He'd see it tomorrow, and he knew what else he'd see. The lab emptied, guards clanking outside. Swan stayed, staring at Price's sketch on the table. The dome loomed, cracked and cold. He closed his eyes, testing the dark. The shadow flickered there, taller, its edges pulsing like a heartbeat. He snapped his eyes open, breath short. Race, he whispered to no one. Yeah, sure feels like one. The SRI lab hummed with tension the next morning, January 1974, as Richard Hensley paced near the door, a cigarette smoldering between his fingers. Pat Price's sketch of the Semipalatinsk lab, cracked dome, glowing amplifier, lay pinned to a corkboard, flanked by satellite shots rushed from Langley. They were blurry, but the outlines matched. Low buildings, a dome, heat signatures hinting at something big underground. Hensley's jaw was tight. He'd briefed DC at dawn, and the brass wanted more fast. Ingo Swan sat off to the side, arms crossed, still sour about being dragged back in. His eyes were bloodshot, the shadow's pulse lingering from a sleepless night. Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff huddled over Price's EEG charts, murmuring about signal spikes, while Price himself sipped coffee, unfazed by the chaos he'd stirred. The door creaked open, and a young woman stepped in, Clara Evans, barely 25, with sharp green eyes and a nervous edge. Her dark hair was pulled back tight, and she clutched a worn satchel like a shield. Hensley had found her in Virginia, a college dropout who'd spooked a local shrink with tales of hearing voices, distant, specific, tied to places she'd never been. He'd flown her out on a hunch, and now she stood there, dwarfed by the room's intensity. Clara, Hensley said, stubbing out his cigarette. Glad you made it. This is the team, Swan, Price, Targ, Puthoff. They see. You hear. Let's see if it fits. Clara nodded, voice soft. I'll try. Swan's gaze flicked to her, curious despite himself. Hear what, exactly? Thoughts, she said, meeting his eyes. Not here, out there. Places I shouldn't know. It's loud sometimes. Hensley gestured to the corkboard. Same target as yesterday, Semipalatinsk. Price saw it, sketched it. You listen. Tell us what's inside. Clara hesitated, then stepped forward, studying Price's drawing. The dome loomed, coils and pipes tangled around that glowing core. She'd never done this on command. Her episodes came unbidden, waking her with voices in Russian, German, once Japanese. Hensley's call had been a lifeline. She'd thought she was losing her mind. Coordinates? She asked. Puthoff handed her the slip. 50 degrees, 10 minutes north, 78 degrees, 40 minutes east, same as Price's. No prep, he said. Just focus. Clara sat, closing her eyes, fingers brushing the paper. The room faded, and a cold wind hit her first, dry, biting, like Price's desert dust. Then the voices came, faint at first, overlapping in Russian. She didn't speak it, but the meaning seeped through, raw and jagged. Test 3, power at 60%, she murmured, brows furrowing. Man's voice clipped. Rod's stable, but the field's uneven. Another, older, angry. Push it higher, or we lose the window. Hensley leaned in, scribbling notes. Field. Clara's head tilted, like she was tuning a radio. Buzzing loud in their heads. Amplifiers holding, psi output up 10 points. They're excited, nervous too. Someone's coughing, says radiation's spiking. Swan shifted, unease prickling. Psi output. Amplifier. The Soviets weren't just building bombs. They were boosting something like him. He glanced at Price, who watched Clara with calm interest, no sign of the shadow Swan couldn't shake. Anything else? Targ asked, recorder whirring. Clara's voice dropped slower. Footsteps, heavy boots. Colonel wants results by dawn. Then quiet. No, not quiet, whispering. It's working, he's hearing us. Her eyes snapped open, wide and startled. They stopped. Like they knew I was there. Hensley froze, pen hovering. Knew. I don't know, Clara said, breathless. It felt sharp, like a needle turning back. Puthoff frowned, checking the EEG he'd rigged to her. Spike here, same as Price's, but shorter. Could be feedback. Feedback? Hensley snapped. From what? Her, Swan said, voice low. If they're amplifying, maybe they're listening too. The room went still. Hensley's mind raced. Price's vision, Clara's voices, the telex from 72 about Soviet psychics. If they'd built an amplifier, they could be probing back, sniffing out his team. He crushed his notepad in his fist. We need more. Swan, you're up tomorrow, same spot. I want everything. Swan's stomach twisted. Told you, I'm not a machine. And I told you we're behind. Hensley shot back. They're ahead, Clara just proved it. Rest up, or we're screwed. Clara looked between them, guilt flickering. I didn't mean. Not your fault. Price cut in steady. You heard what I saw. That's enough for now. Hensley ignored the softness, storming to the door. Targ, get her data to Langley. Puthoff, figure out that feedback. We're not losing this. He left, slamming the door. Clara exhaled, shaky, while Price offered her his coffee. First days are rough, he said. You'll get used to it. Swan didn't move, staring at the sketch. Whispers, he's hearing us. The shadow pulsed in his mind, taller, its edges humming like Price's machine. What if it wasn't just him? What if the Soviets had tapped something bigger? Something watching them all? He stood, abrupt. I'm out. See you tomorrow. Targ called after him, but Swan was gone, boots echoing down the hall. The shadow wasn't a trick anymore. It was tied to this, Semipalatinsk, the amplifier, maybe Clara's voices. He'd see it again tomorrow, and it'd see him too. The Semipalatinsk lab crouched in Kazakhstan's frozen steppe, a brutalist slab of concrete lashed by January 1974's biting wind. Inside, beneath the cracked dome Pat Price had seen, Colonel Yuri Volkov stood over a humming machine. 10 feet tall, a tangle of steel coils and uranium rods glowing faint yellow through thick glass. His uniform hung loose on a wiry frame, and his gray eyes glinted with a mix of exhaustion and zeal. The air stank of ozone and sweat, the floor vibrating with the device's low pulse. Volkov barked in Russian, voice sharp over the noise. Test 4, 80%. Now. 2 scientists in lab coats, one goggled, one coughing, adjusted dials, their hands trembling. The hum deepened, a bone-rattling thrum, and the glow flared. A third man, wiry and pale, sat strapped to a chair beside it, Andrei, their best sender, a psychic plucked from a Siberian gulag. Electrodes studded his scalp, wires snaking to the machine. His eyes were shut, breath shallow. Field stabilizing, the goggled scientist said, checking a gauge. Psi output up 15 points. Volkov nodded, arms crossed. The amplifier was his brainchild, 3 years of stolen German research, uranium scraps, and desperation. The KGB had laughed at first, but results silenced them. Andrei had sent images to a handler 50 miles away last month. Now Moscow demanded more, range, precision, enough to spy on the Americans without leaving the steppe. Push it, Volkov ordered. I want 100%. The coughing scientist hesitated. Radiation's climbing. Could fry him. He'll live, Volkov snapped. Do it. The dials turned and the hum spiked, a sound like tearing metal. Andrei twitched, a groan escaping his lips. Volkov watched, unflinching, as the scientist read off numbers. 90%, Psi output 20 points. He's reaching, stronger than before. Where? Volkov asked. The goggled man tapped a map, California, a dot near Menlo Park. There. Same signal we caught last week. Volkov's pulse quickened. The Americans had something, psychics maybe probing his lab. Yesterday's test had picked up a faint echo, a mind brushing theirs. Today, he'd push back. Focus him, he said. Find them. Andrei's head jerked, sweat beading on his brow. The machine's glow pulsed, and Volkov felt it, a prickle like static on his skin. Andrei muttered, voice slurred. Cold lab voices. Woman, green eyes. She's hearing us. Volkov froze. Woman. Listening, Andrei rasped. She's close, too close. The scientists exchanged glances. The coughing one coughed harder. Feedback loop, he's sensing her sensing us. Shut it down, Volkov said sharp. Now. The dials spun back, the hum dying to a whine. Andrei slumped, gasping, blood trickling from his nose. The glow faded, leaving the dome dim. Volkov stared at the map, mind racing. A woman hearing them American at SRI. The CIA's program wasn't just rumor anymore. They were in a race, and he'd just felt their breath on his neck. Get him up, Volkov said, pointing at Andrei. Clean him. I want him ready by dawn, full power. The goggled scientist unstrapped Andrei, who coughed wetly, barely conscious. Colonel, if we push harder. We will, Volkov cut in. They're ahead. That woman, he felt her. They're not just seeing, they're listening. He grabbed a radio, barking into it. Moscow, this is Volkov. Confirmed contact, American psychic, female, auditory. Amplify tomorrow, maximum output. Send backup. The line crackled, a voice confirming. Volkov set it down, staring at the machine. The Americans had beaten him to Kazakhstan 2 years ago. Swan's hit, he'd learned later through a mole. Now they were here, in his head. He wouldn't lose again. Across the ocean, at SRI, Clara Evans sat trembling in the lab's break room, a blanket around her shoulders. Hensley paced nearby, his cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling. Swan and Price watched from the doorway, silent, while Targ scribbled notes from her session. It turned, Clara said, voice shaky. Like it knew I was there. Hensley stopped, glaring at her. Who? Not who, she said. What? The voice, he's hearing us. Then it stopped like a switch. Swan's gut twisted. The shadow flared in his mind, taller, humming like Price's amplifier. He hadn't seen Semipalatinsk yet, but Clara's words echoed too close. They're pushing back, he said low. Hensley spun on him. Pushing what? Us, Swan said. If she felt them, they felt her. That's not just an amplifier, it's a weapon. Price nodded, calm as ever. Makes sense. Boosts their guy, catches ours. Hensley crushed his cigarette underfoot. Then we push harder. Swan, you're on tomorrow, same damn spot. I want everything they've got. Swan didn't argue, but his hands clenched. Tomorrow meant diving in, facing the shadow, and now whatever the Soviets were throwing back. Clara's green eyes met his, haunted, and he saw his own fear mirrored there. The race was on, and they were all pawns. The SRI lab was a hive of frayed nerves by late January 1974, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the whine of overworked machines. Ingo Swan sat hunched over a table, sketching the Semipalatinsk lab from his morning session. Cracked dome, glowing coils, the same as Price's vision. But his lines were shaky, smudged where his hand faltered. The shadow had been there, clearer than ever, tall, faceless, standing over the amplifier like a sentinel. It hadn't just watched this time. It had pulsed, a hum syncing with the machine's thrum. Richard Hensley loomed nearby, flipping through Swan's sketch and Clara Evans' transcript from yesterday. Her voices, he's hearing us, matched Swan's report, Russian mutterings about psi output and a kernel. The overlap was too tight to ignore. Hensley's tie hung loose, his voice sharp. They're amplifying, all right. Swan's got the layout, Clara's got their chatter. We're closing in. Russell Targ adjusted his recorder, frowning. Ingo's fading, though. Look at him, barely holding it together. Swan snorted, not looking up. I'm fine. Just need a damn break. You're not fine, Harold Puthoff said, eyeing the EEG charts. Your spikes are off the charts, stress may be worse. Hensley waved it off. He's tough. Where's Price? I want him on this too, triple the data. The door creaked and a guard stepped in, face pale. Sir, Price is down. Collapsed in the hall, medics are with him. Hensley spun. What? Heart stopped, the guard said. They're trying, but... Swan's pencil snapped in his hand. He stood, unsteady, and followed Hensley as they bolted out, Targ and Puthoff trailing. In the hallway, Pat Price lay sprawled on the tile, medics pumping his chest. His coffee mug rolled nearby, spilled black pooling under a bench. Clara hovered at the edge, eyes wide, hands trembling. Move, Hensley barked, shoving through. What happened? Found him like this, a medic said, breathless. No pulse, sudden, no warning. Swan stared, a cold weight settling in his gut. Price had been steady, rock solid, no shakes, no shadows. Now he was gray, lifeless, eyes staring at nothing. The medics worked, but Swan knew. He'd felt it before, a snap like a thread breaking. Not natural. Hensley knelt, grabbing Price's sketch from the day before off the floor. He was fine yesterday. This doesn't happen. Clara whispered. I heard something earlier. A scream, sharp then gone. Hensley glared at her. When? An hour ago, she said. Thought it was me, my head. But, Swan's voice cut through, low and rough. It's them. The amplifier. They turned to him. He clutched the broken pencil, knuckles white. I felt it today, the hum their machine. It's not just boosting, it's hitting back. Price saw it first, then me, then Clara heard it. They're targeting us. Puthoff shook his head. That's impossible. Psychic feedback doesn't kill. Tell that to him, Swan snapped, nodding at Price. The medic stopped, one wiping sweat from his brow. He's gone. Time of death, 11:42. Hensley stood slow, fists clenched. Get him out. Autopsy, full workup. I want answers. The guards lifted Price onto a stretcher, his bulk sagging under the sheet. Clara turned away, a sob catching in her throat. Swan stayed rooted, the shadow flashing in his mind. Pulsing, humming, stronger now. He'd seen it over the amplifier, and it had seen him. What if it wasn't just watching? What if it could reach? Hensley pulled a folded note from Price's pocket, scribbled, smudged. The Watchers, it read in Price's blocky hand. Hensley stared, then shoved it at Swan. What's this? Swan's breath hitched. No idea, he lied. Watchers. Price had seen it too, maybe not the shadow, but something. Had it gotten him? His head throbbed, the hum echoing in his skull. Bullshit, Hensley said. You're rattled, both of you. Spill it. Nothing to spill, Swan said, voice tight. He's dead. That's what matters. Hensley's eyes bored into him, but he let it drop. Clean this up, he told Targ. Clara, you're off today. Swan, rest, or I'll strap you to a bed myself. He stormed off, barking orders into a radio. Swan sank against the wall, the note burning in his mind. Watchers. The shadow wasn't his alone anymore. Price had felt it, maybe paid for it. Clara edged closer, voice small. You saw something, didn't you? The SRI lab felt like a tomb by dusk, January 1974. The silence broken only by the faint hum of machines and Clara Evans' stifled sobs in the break room. Pat Price's body was gone, carted off for autopsy, but his absence hung heavy. Ingo Swan sat alone at the table, staring at Price's last note. The Watchers, smudged in his blocky scrawl. The shadow pulsed in Swan's mind, its hum louder since the morning's vision of Semipalatinsk. He hadn't told Hensley, hadn't told anyone, but Price's death cracked something open. It wasn't just him anymore. Richard Hensley stormed in, a fresh cigarette already lit, his suit rumpled from hours on the phone with Langley. Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff trailed him, faces drawn. Autopsy's fast-tracked, Hensley said, voice rough. Heart attack, they think, sudden, no warning. Bullshit. He was 49, healthy as a horse. Swan's eyes flicked up. You know it wasn't natural. Hensley glared, exhaling smoke. I know he dropped after you and Clara started spouting about feedback. Soviets hit us. I'd bet my badge on it. Targ shook his head, adjusting his glasses. We don't have proof. EEGs show stress, not murder. Then get proof, Hensley snapped. They're amplifying psychics. Clara heard them, Swan saw it. Price dies the next day. That's no coincidence. Puthoff rubbed his temples. If it's a weapon, it's beyond anything we've tested. We'd need. Needs off the table, Hensley cut in. We're doing. Swan, you're back on now. Same target. I want their playbook. Swan stood slow, the broken pencil from earlier still in his pocket. Price just died. You're pushing me into the same meat grinder. You're alive, Hensley said cold. He's not. We're behind, and they're not waiting. Sit. Swan's jaw tightened, but he sat. Curiosity gnawed at him, Price's Watchers, the shadow, the hum. He had to know. Puthoff handed him the coordinates. 50 degrees, 10 minutes north, 78 degrees, 40 minutes east, same as before. Targ started the recorder, and Hensley loomed, arms crossed. Focus, Puthoff said, clipping EEG wires to Swan's scalp. Deep as you can. Swan closed his eyes, sinking fast. The step hit first, cold, dusty, the dome squat against a gray sky. The amplifier loomed inside, coils glowing hotter now, uranium rods pulsing yellow. Men in coats moved, voices muffled, Russian urgent. Full power, one said, and the hum spiked, a wave that shook Swan's bones. Then it was there, the shadow, towering over the machine, its edges rippling with the hum. It wasn't just watching. It turned, slow, faceless head tilting toward him. Swan's breath caught, pencil scratching blind. Dome coils, the shadow's outline. They're running it hard, he muttered. 100%, psi outputs off the scale. Someone strapped in, bleeding from the nose. Hensley leaned closer. Who? Don't know, Swan said, voice tight. Mail thin. He's sending hard. The hum's alive. It's pushing out, looking. The shadow pulsed, and Swan felt it, pressure, like fingers in his skull. His hand shook, the sketch veering wild. It's here, he rasped. Sees me. What sees you? Hensley barked. Swan's eyes snapped open, sweat beading on his brow. Something tied to their machine. It's not them, it's bigger. Hensley grabbed the sketch. Dome, amplifier, a jagged shadow dominating the page. Bigger how? I don't know. Swan shouted, ripping off the electrodes. Price saw it too, watchers. It's not just their tech, it's using it. Clara stepped in, blanket slipping from her shoulders. I heard it again, she said, voice small. While you were under. He's back, cut it now. Then a scream, same as before. Hensley's cigarette dropped, smoldering on the floor. They're targeting us. Killing us. Swan slumped, head in his hands. The hum lingered, the shadow's gaze burned into him. Maybe. Or it's not them, it's that thing. Price felt it, and it got him. Puthoff stared at the EEG, needles off the chart. This is impossible. Psychic overload doesn't stop hearts. Tell that to the corpse, Swan muttered. Hensley crushed the cigarette under his heel. Enough. Clara, you're off rest. Swan, you too. Targ, Puthoff, figure out how they're doing this. I'm calling Langley, we're hitting back. He stormed out, radio crackling. Clara lingered, eyes on Swan. You saw it, didn't you? What I heard. Yeah, Swan said low. And it saw me. She nodded, retreating to the break room. Swan stayed, staring at his sketch. The shadow wasn't a trick. It was alive, linked to the amplifier, maybe feeding it. Price's death wasn't random. It was a warning. Outside, Hensley barked into the radio. Get me DC priority. Soviet psychic weapon confirmed. We need tech manpower now. He hung up, lighting another cigarette. The race was on, Price's blood proved it. Swan was fraying, Clara was scared, but they were all he had. The Soviets weren't just ahead, they were lethal. He'd push until they broke, or he did.